So I'm hopeful that this is going to be more of an interactive section of the agenda. Um, I got some new stuff to share with y'all today. I feel like Erica Badu. I got some new stuff, and I'm sensitive. But we're going to work it out and get through it together. My name is Louis Shakelford, he, him pronouns. I am the Director of External Relations at the HIV Vaccine Trials Network. And look, let's ride. So my agenda today, my purpose here is to give you a biomedical update, and I thought very long and hard about how I was going to do that, considering an hour, probably less than an hour for Q&A. So I want to just focus on a few things. I'm going to just give a little background of our current prevention options that we have in HIV. I'm going to talk about mainly two of the big topics that we have going on in our field right now in HIV prevention, which is lenacapavir and a medication that's been developed by Gilead. And I'm going to talk in detail about it. And then I'm going to talk to you about broadly neutralizing antibodies, which is something that we're working on at the HIV Vaccine Trials Network. And then we're going to do Q&A. But I very much encourage you that throughout this presentation, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, I welcome those throughout the presentation. We don't have to wait to the end. I rather, if there is something pertinent or stimulating that you want to talk about, that we focus on that as opposed to me preaching to you through my slides, because I am not a preacher. Um, Before I launch any further, I just want to say and acknowledge, I'm going to be talking about HIV prevention and kind of the two hot topics in HIV prevention, at least from my perspective right now. But just recognizing that our field is big and vast. There's prevention of STIs through things like DoxyPEP and DoxyPrep, which is a big topic of discussion on STIs prevention right now. There's cure research, HIV cure research going on. There's all sorts of treatment research and innovations going on in the treatment space. So I just want to acknowledge that to cover all that would be way too much in this time frame. So I'm just going to talk about a little piece of HIV prevention today. So before we launch into things, a little bit about me. Again, I'm the Director of External Relations at the HIV Vaccine Trials Network. I'm based out of Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center, which is in Seattle, Washington. I serve as a liaison between communities and the science, so making sure that science is represented in the community and making sure that community is represented in scientific spaces. I've been doing this for, just did the math, it was like going on. I made 15 years, actually this month makes about 15 years doing this work, which is crazy because I don't feel that old. And fun fact about me, when I'm not doing this HIV Vaccine Trials Network stuff, I partner with one of my colleagues and friends, Rodney McCoy, to do sex positivity trainings through the lens of kink. If you want to know about any of that, see me after. So, again, looking at the current prevention options that we have, I don't think this is going to be new to many of you, if not all of you. So these are kind of the landscape of HIV prevention as it stands right now. We have things, old school things, I would say, like condoms. We have internal condoms and external condoms. Used to be called condoms and female condoms, but we now use the term internal and external condoms. We have things like U equals U, undetectable equals untransmissible, lubricants, HIV testing. Some of the new kids on the block, we have oral PrEP, 1 pill a day to take to prevent yourself from acquiring HIV. But now we also have injectable PrEP. So this is an injectable that you take. One that we have approved right now is called cabotegravir, and that is an injectable you take every 2 months that will prevent you from getting HIV. You also have post-exposure prophylaxis, and you can always just change your behavior to reduce HIV acquisition. So we have lots of things on the docket that will prevent you from getting HIV. Thank goodness. And so just acknowledging these things, but also acknowledging that we still need more options. We still have a raging HIV epidemic, particularly in segments of the population. People of color are still disproportionately impacted by HIV across this country and across the globe. So we're still pressing forward to create more options that are beneficial for all. I realize I do not have my notes. So the back end of this presentation is going to be real interesting. Um, but I want to get into our first major innovation. You may have heard about this medication. It's called lenacapavir. So this is a long-acting HIV prevention medication. So lenacapavir is an injectable medication. Sometimes you'll hear the folks who make it call it Len. It is an investigational antiretroviral medication, so the same type of medication that people take to treat HIV. This is the same type of medication just being used in people who don't have HIV to prevent them from acquiring HIV. It is given every 6 months. That's the big bang, wow, zoom factor, is that this is a every 6 months, potentially a twice a year medication. This is an injectable, so when you are taking lenacapavir, it is injected two subcutaneous injections given at the same visit. A subcutaneous injection is just right under the skin. It's different from an intermuscular injection, which is in the muscle. So this one, because it's subcutaneous, it's usually given in the abdomen, right under the skin. Whereas, as I mentioned, cabotegravir, that is an intermuscular injection, and so it needs a nice, big, juicy muscle to be injected in. And the muscle of choice that most doctors choose is this one right here. So it is being developed by one of the sponsors of this conference, Gilead Sciences. Shout out to Gilead. And it is approved in multiple countries under the brand of Sunlenca. So it's not approved yet for PrEP. That's the biggest thing. So this is still investigational for PrEP. And so where are we right now in terms of the research concerning lenacapavir? And so there are currently 5 trials looking at lenacapavir in different populations across the globe. All these trials are called purpose trials. And so you'll see purpose 1, purpose 2, purpose 3, purpose 4, versus 5. The one that has gotten out the gate and that we started to get preliminary data from that seems really promising, and is the reason why I'm talking to you about this right now, is Purpose 1. Purpose 1 is being conducted in cisgender adolescent girls and young women in South Africa and Uganda. They're enrolling about 5,010 people, and they kicked off around 2002, and now we're at the point in 2024, we already passed the point in 2024 where they released preliminary data. That's what this star is. That green star is when they're starting this. We're going to start to see data, and we're going to talk about that data. But I just want to acknowledge this is the first study, and so when you're looking at a medication, the way it works is that you want to make sure that it works for everybody in the same way. And so that means that you have to be examining the medication or the intervention in these different populations individually. And so we're starting out with cisgender girls and women in Southern Africa. There's also Purpose 2, and these are all phase 3 studies. So these two are phase 3 studies. So these are large clinical trials. So you see the thousands there. Anytime you see phase 3 studies, these are really big trials in the thousands. And so these two are 2 of the biggest trials that are going to move this forward and likely get it closer and closer to approval. And so Purpose 2 is looking at cisgender men who have sex with men, transgender women, transgender men, and gender non-binary folks. And this is going to be in the U.S., Southern Africa, Peru, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, and Thailand. They're enrolling about 3,000 people. The study started in 2022, but we're not going to get data from that part of the study till around the end of this year, early next year. So that is to come. Moving forward, we also are looking at, this is all done by a sister network of ours called the HIV Prevention Trials Network. We're also looking at how lenacapavir works in cisgender women in the U.S. We're also looking at how lenacapavir is going to work for people who inject drugs in the U.S. as well. And then the final study cohort that's going to be enrolled is the men who have sex with men, transgender women, transgender men, and non-binary folks in France and UK. Not really, I haven't gotten a lot of detail on this particular version of it because it seems really similar to what we have going on in the US. My guess is that we need to do something specifically in Europe because of the European Medical Association, which has very, very different standards to the FDA and how they approve medications. So any questions about this? I know that's a lot. Any questions about how lenacapavir is being studied? All right, I'll say Ms. Hope Giselle. Hold on, let's for the people online.
So with the study, is it 3,000 people total for at least, I guess, the purpose two, or is it 3,000 people for demographic of person? Like 3,000?
That's a good question. So it's 3,000 people total. So there is a more detailed breakdown of this. I believe that these studies do have some quotas that they're trying to reach, which tends to be the case when studies are trying to make sure that they are diverse. So in that way, quotas are a good thing. So they'll have a quota of, reaching 10% trans people, which I think that study purpose 2 does have that type of quota. And they also may have a quota of like 50% people of color. But yeah, that's a good question. So this is 3,000 people in total. Oh, let me go back. 3,000 people in total and 5,000 people in total. Any other questions? Okay. So what are the results been so far? So I'm not going to get too deep into the study design, but the way they designed these studies is they compared lenacapavir versus FTAF, which is basically the formula for Descovy. So they basically compared it to Descovy and then good old-fashioned Truvada from back in the day. They also looked at what we call the background incidence. So that's just the number of people who get newly diagnosed just in the population on a regular basis. And so comparing all these things versus lenacapavir, they found that of the 2,134 women that have taken lenacapavir, exactly 0 have gotten HIV. This is the first time, you can clap. This is one of the first times we've seen a result like this, if not the first time, where we had a medication that has seen such positive results that there are literally no cases being reported in those who are taking the medication. So that has been the biggest thing in the HIV space, particularly the HIV research space. This came out at a really big HIV conference that we had in Munich, Germany earlier this year, and there was clapping and applause and cheering because this in some ways is could be one of the biggest game changers in the HIV space that we ever seen. A medication that you can come in, get injected twice a year, and then you go about your day and you never have to worry about getting HIV. So for those, and just for clarity, so we did see cases, we've seen 2.02 cases of those taking Descovy in the trial, 1.69 cases of those taking good old-fashioned Truvada, and then in the population, just on a regular basis, we see 2.4 cases. So I just wanted to clarify that a lot of these cases tends to be because there's a reduction in people taking medication as prescribed. And so when you have to take a pill every once a day, because Descovy and Truvada are pills that you have to take once a day. You miss a dose, and then it leaves you vulnerable to getting HIV. And so that's one of the things that's really exciting about these long-acting, what we call long-acting injectables, is that you have that protection on demand as you need it without having to think about it on a regular basis, on an everyday basis, like you would with Descovy and Truvada. So I say that to say Descovy and Truvada are really great medications. They do a really good job of protecting you from HIV if you take them as prescribed. It just so happens that we find that there are a lot of people that have a hard time taking them as prescribed. And I think, people in this room know why. We have a lot of things going on in life outside of HIV that prevents us from always focusing on things like taking a pill once a day. So, any questions about this? So, this study is taking place, going back to my other slide. So this study. Uh, so your question was again, let me make sure. So his question was, what's the timeline of this particular study? So for purpose one, it looks like the timeline is from 2002 to probably mid 2004, 2024 for data results. I have to look at my slides in the notes to see like when the study is going to conclude enrollment. But it's probably, since it started in 2022, usually large efficacy trials run for like 3 to 4 years. So this is preliminary data. So this is like, preliminary data comes usually a third of a way to halfway through the trial. But that's a good question. Any other questions? There are like y'all haven't seen it, but there are like really like complex diagrams of like this Linda Capavir and like all the stuff that they put into recruiting and retention and like global cabs. And I'll give it to Gilead. They did a really good job, and they were really intentional about making sure that diverse populations were included, that there was community input. They seem to really go above and beyond for these. But there's like a whole nother set of slides that gets into like the nitty gritty of that. So I was trying to give you kind of a fly overview so that you weren't overwhelmed and I didn't have to spend like an hour just explaining 2 slides. Any questions about that? Any questions about Linda Capavir? All right. Last thing I wanted to show you, I thought this was really cool for everybody to see. So it's a comparison of the current HIV prevention medication that we have as an injectable, cabotegravir. This is the one that I spoke about earlier, versus our potential new one on the horizon, lenacapavir. And so you see that these are 2 different types of HIV antiviral medications, meaning that this is an integrase inhibitor, this is a capsid inhibitor, so they are attacking, if you will, so to speak, they are attacking HIV at 2 different points in the reproductive process of HIV, so that's interesting. There are not many capsid inhibitors as well, so that's a novel thing about this medication. Again, this is intramuscular versus subcutaneous. So this is normally given in the buttocks. This is in the abdomen. As you can see, it really is the same amount of dosing. It's just this is 1 dose of 3 mLs. This is 2, 1.5. But it amounts to the same. The amount of injections is the really big difference. So this really ends up with you having to get injections every 2 months currently, whereas this one is going to have you getting injections every 6 months, twice a year. Both have very high efficacy. again, this one has already received regulatory approval. It's out there. Here you see the price per year. Two different companies. So this cabotegravir is made by ViiV Healthcare. Lenacapavir, as I said earlier, is Gilead Sciences. And then you see some information about when we expect generic medications or generic versions of this medications to be available. So it might have access to a generic version of cabotegravir by 2027. I don't, until we get actual approval, we're not going to know when we'll have a potential generic of lenacapavir. So that's the big question, is that we have these great tools, they're being created, they're potentially on the verge of approval. What is access going to look like? And the honest question is that we don't know. Really, a lot of that is in Gilead's hands. I don't know if we have any Gilead reps in the room. No? Okay, so I won't hold my tongue. So we, I can speak freely. So we don't know what Gilead is going to do in terms of how they're going to roll it out. I know that there are a lot of community activists, pounding them right now, saying that you have to get this right because we know that they haven't gotten things right before, particularly Descovy. They did a bad job in making sure that was approved for everybody, and still to this day, Descovy is not approved for cisgender women. To this day, and that is a product of Gilead not doing their due diligence to make sure that population was included in the study population that got Descovy approved. And so if you are a cisgender woman, right now your choice is only Truvada in terms of an oral medication. So that is how we're doing on time. Okay. So any questions, any thoughts about that before we move on? I'm going to jump into BNABs. Yes. So yes. So the question was, would this be for women? And no, not my response is this: the way that they are doing, because they are go back. Because they are inclusive of just about every population, this is going to be for everybody. So is it going to be for women? Yes. Yes. So Descovy, that was approved based on a trial that only looked at men who have sex with men. I think, and they also looked at, in that trial, the population was also trans women who have sex with men. So because that trial only examined how Descovy worked for those populations, when it came up for approval, they could only say with confidence that it works for these populations. So any populations outside of that, namely cisgender women, that's cisgender women across the board, not just black women, cisgender women across the board, because they were not included in the study population that got Descovy approved. There is no indication for Descovy for cisgender women. So if you went to your doctor and you said, I'm a cisgender woman, I want to be prescribed Descovy, the doctor can potentially do it, but he have to do it what they call off-label, because the label literally does not say that this is going to work for you. Sure.
Biomedically, Descovy was tested to have activity on rectal tissue versus vaginal tissue. And so specifically, if you are a woman who has sex vaginally, then Descovy doesn't apply to you. If you were a woman who has anal sex exclusively, Descovy might work for you because of its biomedical action. But that's the reason why women weren't included and what the biomedical activity of the actual medications focus on. Truvada focuses on um, the vaginal mucosa versus the rectal.
Was you said um I I can't speak for Gilead. I can just say that they I'm not sure it was intentional. I think that what was intentional is that they felt that the populations that they chose were going to be the ones that primarily used it, and so those were the populations that they went with. But that's just me theorizing how Gilead works, and I don't work for Gilead. I saw your hand, Hope.
Um, I'm not. I'm really not. Both of y'all leave me alone. No, but based off of what Ulysses just said, as a trans woman who's had bottom surgery, have they done those? Are they doing that with this new one?
So that is a really good question, and I would say just in general, we have very little data about trans women that have had bottom surgery and how um, medications interact with neo vagina versus a biological vagina. Um, I have not looked up that data. I will also say I have not looked up that data to see if there has been any new findings in that area. Um, but I will say that in general, there's not a lot about it. But if you want to talk more about it and talk more about like what's out there, I'm happy to do a search with you to see what's new, if anything. That's a good question. Any other questions before we move on? How much time do I have left? Okay, so now I got to storm do the B naps. So one of the things that we are focused on at the HIV Vaccine Trials Network is broadly neutralizing antibodies. And so broadly neutralizing antibodies are kind of similar to a long-acting injectable like lenacapavir in that this is an intervention that can be injected and gives you protection over time. However, it's not a medication. And so let's jump into it. So first, just give some backgrounds on what are antibodies. So antibodies are proteins that are part of the immune system. So you have plenty of antibodies in your body right now. They're natural to the body. They are specific for each disease, each invader that comes your way. So whenever you have the flu, for example, your body is going to produce antibodies that are specific to the strain of flu that you have come in contact with. When it comes to HIV, each antibody that is produced is, again, going to be specific to the strain of HIV that you are currently combating at that time. And researchers have found that there are people, and this is no surprise to us because a lot of us have known people that don't take a medication but don't suffer any consequences of HIV, even though that they are living with HIV. Those people now, I think when I first came into the field, we called them long-term non-progressors. I think that terminology has gone away, and now they call them elite controllers. But they're essentially people who bodies are really, really good at fighting HIV just on their own. And so scientists have looked at people of that ilk and find that part of the reason why they're good at fighting HIV without taking medication is because they have special antibodies. Their body just happens to make special antibodies called broadly neutralizing antibodies that are really good at fighting HIV. So, broadly neutralizing antibodies are antibodies that are able to block or neutralize many different types of HIV. So, they literally stop HIV. They attach to HIV. So if my hand was HIV, they would attach to it and they would stop it from infecting my cells as I like hold through this situation with my mic. Um, And so the thought is that in lieu of a vaccine, we don't have a vaccine yet, but we know of these antibodies that kind of do the work of a vaccine. A vaccine teaches your body how to make these antibodies and therefore giving you that protection innately. So we already know that these antibodies exist. We already know how to make them based on the people that have who create them naturally. So we can take them into the lab, we can make them. What if we just give them to you? What if we just give you these antibodies to prevent you from getting HIV? And so skipping the step of giving you a vaccine and giving you the antibodies, that comes with immediate protection against HIV. And the thought is, or from what we've seen, these antibodies can last upwards of possibly 6 months in the body. I've seen anything from 4 to 6 months. And so giving you similar coverage as you would with a medication like lenacapavir, but it's more natural in the body. So it's not a medication, so you don't have to deal with the same sort of side effects that you would with a medication over time. And because antibodies are natural to the body, you have tons of antibodies in your bodies right now. The safety profile is much different than a medication that is not innate to your body. And so broadly neutralizing antibodies tend to be more safe and have lower, which means they have a lower amount of side effects from what we've seen so far. Yes. Oops. You are you asking if you how do you know if you are a person that produces these antibodies or like an elite controller? Hmm. Yeah, so the only way you would know if you are an elite controller is if you were a person living with HIV that stopped taking medication or never took medication. That's as far as I know, that'd be the only way that you know that you're an elite controller. You would have to come into contact with HIV and see how your body responds, basically. As far as I know, there's no tests. And Ulysses, let me know if you okay. As far as I know, there's no test that can determine if you are an elite controller. There are people that have certain genetic variations that make it harder for them to get HIV, but that's a whole nother can of worms that I don't know if I'm ready to get into. That comes into play when you have cure research. I want to show this video. I don't know if I can hit it. Oh, oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. You got me my notes. I was, I was about to have a real hard time. So this is the video giving you a little more of a visualization on how antibodies, broadly neutralizing antibodies work. And so I'll let the video starts again. So at the bottom is your host cell. Let's say that's my cell. It's a normal cell in my body. And these are antibodies in just running around my immune system trying to protect me from HIV. And so when you have HIV come into the picture, the antibodies in my body block the receptors that HIV uses to attach to my cell and essentially block HIV from infecting me. Um, and then once they have attached to HIV and covered it, they signal to other parts of the immune system to come and destroy HIV and clear it from my body. This is what antibodies do all day, every day, anytime you have a disease. This is not unique to HIV. This is just how your body works. This is just how antibodies work in general. So again, the idea is that we can give you the antibodies that are specific to HIV to give you this type of protection, um, and give you that immediate protection that you would from antibodies. I think I have a few minutes left, so I'm going to see how much of this? The big takeaway here is that where are we with the antibody studies? So that was just background. So one of the biggest antibody studies we've done is called AMP. AMP stands for Antibody-Mediated Prevention. And so this was our big study that we conducted at the HIV Vaccine Trials Network, and we did it in collaboration with our sister network, the HIV Prevention Trials Network, to see, this is what we call a proof of concept study. So it's just trying to see if this works for the first time. It wasn't about getting anything approved by the FDA. It was just seeing, hey, can this actually work? Can we give you antibodies that can prevent you from getting HIV and you have that protection? So we did it. Again, I'm going to go through this really quickly, so I'm not going to get it, but we did it in countries in the U.S., South America, and South Africa. We did it in populations both of MSM, transgender people in the U.S. and the Americas in general, and then in South Africa, again, it was cisgender women and girls. So it asked the question, one, is this safe? And we found out that most participants had no side effects, so it seemed extremely safe. But it also asked the question of, does this work? Can it actually do what we think it can do? And the question was, for this particular antibody, which was called VRC01, all these antibodies are going to have really like technical names, but this one was called VRC01. VRC01 didn't do a great job of protecting against a lot of different strains of HIV. But we did found, when you looked at it, that people who got VRC01, particularly in higher doses, they did show protection for very specific strains of HIV. So this antibody wasn't as broad as we like it to be. But when it did work, it worked really well. Like, it gave 70% protection to those who took it. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's a good question. So it goes to this question of sensitivity. And that is a word that means that, is this antibody effective against this particular strain of HIV? And we're finding that some antibodies have many different strains of HIV that they show sensitivity to, that they work for, and some antibodies have a lower number. And so it really is about finding antibodies that can cover the most different strains of HIV, because yes, maybe it is the case that we have to update them over time, but if we still get a wide breadth, then maybe that updating doesn't have to happen as much. But for right now, and I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit, like I said, this just talked about safety, and like the majority showed no side effects. There were some local side effects, which means that there were people who had more side effects with just getting shot in your arm than just with the antibody itself. And so that's good, because it hurts when you get things shot in your arm. So that's not surprising that people would not like that. But the fact that outside of that, there were really just mild things, and some of these were seen across. The biggest takeaway here is they were seen across people who got the antibody and placebo. So people who got just regular salt water pumped into their veins had these side effects as well. So it shows that that the antibodies are not the problem, and that they're pretty safe, if not really safe. I'm gonna skip ahead. I'll come back to this. So to your question, sensitivity. And so what we've seen is that we can have antibodies that are sensitive to a lot of different types of HIV. So the more red you see, means that it can cover more strains of HIV, whereas the more blue you see is that this antibody, like right here, whatever these strains are, that it's not really covering those strains. And the thought is that if you take them all, like these are the profiles of each of these antibodies individually, but if you take them all and you put them together, you get a deep red coverage across the board. So whereas antibodies that this antibody clearly doesn't have as much coverage as this one because there's a lot more red up here, meaning that there's like deeper coverage. The red and the yellow means that there's more coverage across the board, whereas you see a lot more blue, meaning that it's not covering as many strains as this one. But you see that where there is like not so great coverage here, like there's good coverage but not great, there's great coverage here in the same for the same strain of HIV. And so that's the thought. If you put them together, you can get great coverage across the board, if that makes sense. And so that leads me, I'm going to go to this video if it works.
This animation shows how bNAbs work to neutralize HIV variants, shown here in various colors, by preventing them from attaching to human cells. These 3 antibodies are being used in current HVTN-HPTN studies and have been identified as the combination to take forward into future studies. HIV has protein spikes on its surface, and antibodies can attach to different facets of these spikes. Antibodies move around in the bloodstream, attach to HIV, and neutralize it, as shown here when the virion turns gray. And they block HIV from being able to attach to human cells. Researchers believe that giving combinations of bNAbs increases the likelihood that more strains of HIV will be blocked. Thanks for watching.
So that's the key takeaway, is that when we had AMP, we were just looking at one antibody and its ability to block HIV, to neutralize HIV. And so our next endeavor is to look at a combination of antibodies. And so we've determined a great combination of antibodies that have coverage across a wide range of HIV strains. And our next big study, which we affectionately want to call Combo AMP, is going to look at a combination of 3 of these antibodies put together that are given through an IV infusion that can potentially, and we want to see if this is a cocktail of antibodies that could potentially be an HIV prevention modality that we can use moving forward, like lenacapavir. I have a few minutes left, so any questions? I'm jumping around. The thought is that we can, what does this have to do with vaccines? Like, we're the HIV Vaccines Network. Why are we looking at antibodies, and why have I spent all this time talking to you about antibodies? We feel like having the right combination of antibodies and determining if this works will get us closer to an effective and safe HIV vaccine, because what we can do is possibly reverse engineer the antibodies that we're using in this study. So we know that a combination of these three antibodies works to prevent you from getting HIV, then we can go and say, can we make something, a vaccine, that we can give you that allows your body to make these antibodies on its own, as opposed to having to give them to you every 6 months through an IV infusion. And that is through what we call discovery medicine trials. That's how we determine, those are the type of trials that we have going on right now to see how to reverse engineer the antibodies that we use in combo AMP, to see if we can create a vaccine that can give you your body the ability to make those vaccines, to make those antibodies naturally. So in summary, AMP studies were a proof of concept. They showed us that antibodies do have the potential to effectively block HIV. We're looking at multiple antibodies in combination to see if we can make this into a viable HIV prevention modality moving forward. And we're really excited about that. We're really excited to talk to you. Hopefully this time next year, I'm giving you a presentation about Combo AMP in that trial and it's being up and running and going. And so with that, I thank you. I think I'm almost at time. I got like 2-3 minutes. So if there are any, I know I ran through that last part pretty fast, but if there's any questions, comments, any thoughts that you wanted to share at this point. Sure. She asked if the slides can be made available. And yes, I can make them available. Yes.
Good afternoon. I know that PrEP has injectables. Do you think that they will ever move towards having an injectable for PEP?
So for those who may not know, PEP is post-exposure prophylactics. So this is something that you take after you feel like you've been exposed or you know you've been exposed to HIV to prevent yourself from fully acquiring HIV through that exposure. You see it a lot in hospitals because people will have needle sticks. And if you have a needle stick, particularly if I draw blood for somebody who's known to be living with HIV, then, and I'm not living with HIV, then I need to take a medication to prevent myself from fully acquiring HIV after exposure. So the question is, we have injectable PrEP before you get exposed. What about after you get exposed? And the answer to your question is a big resounding, I don't know. It is quite possible, I'm sure. I have never been asked that question, and I haven't thought about it. Ulysses, you got any thoughts?
So PrEP, treatment, and PEP are all essentially a combination of the same medications. So in theory, PEP would work as an injection as PrEP works as an injection, but we have to have proof of concept for it to be approved as such, and we get proof of concept through trials. And so until somebody tests injectable PEP and proves and shows that it will work in the same way, we can't say one way or another. But in theory, the ARVs that a person living with HIV takes to keep their HIV under control are a variation of the same ARVs that people who are not living with HIV take to prevent acquiring HIV, are in theory the same medications as people would take after a possible exposure.
And just to piggyback on that point, so remember going back to Descovy, so that medication, as I said, is not approved for cisgender women who want to prevent themselves from getting HIV. To my knowledge, I believe it is approved for cisgender women who are actually living with HIV as a treatment. So, it's really about people who make the medications doing the due diligence to do the trials so that we know that they work in the ways that we're trying to intend to use them.
Thank you. Would that have anything to do with the fact that PEP has to be taken within that 72-hour range?
I don't think so, because what would happen is, in theory, as Ulysses said, you would get, say if I'm the healthcare worker, I stick myself with a needle after doing a blood draw on somebody living with HIV. In theory, I would just get an injectable that prevents me from getting it. Because right now, I just have to take a course of medications. I would have to take a course of oral medications. So in theory, I would just get that injection and I would go about my business, in theory. So as long as I get it done within that 72 hours as recommended, or whatever the time frame, I don't know, maybe it's Maybe it's not 72 hours for an injectable. Maybe it has to be 36. Maybe it has to be 24. I don't know. Because it hasn't been, as far as I know, it hasn't been tested. Last minute questions. I think I'm about at time. Last minute questions, comments before I close completely. Okay. Well, if there's no last minute comments, thank you all for your time. I appreciate you. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day.
What Lewis didn't mention was that the HIV Vaccine Trials Network is very much so invested in equipping faith communities to be able to respond to the HIV epidemic. The HVTN has a faith initiative, which I lead, and it is a significant investment for a biomedical research company to be able to equip communities of faith to have the information that they need to be successful in the response to HIV and AIDS. And so he's not just here as a function of get you this biomedical information. He's also somebody who is a person of faith and manages a portfolio where half of his budget is my faith initiative. And so I wanted to acknowledge that. If you want to learn more about the HIV Vaccine Trials Faith Initiative, you can visit hvtn.org, communities, and find the faith initiative information now.